Hello and welcome to the second of a two-part series on the American way of war. My name is Michael Shurkin and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. In the previous video, I talked about the American way of war, and I talked a lot about the ideas of Russell Weigley, who made this argument about the continuity in American strategic thinking and strategic culture. Now in this video, I'm taking a very different approach, and what I'm doing is I'm looking at French military views on the American way of war. I think that this is a very important topic. For one thing, the French are keen students of American strategic culture and the American military because they see it as something that they absolutely have to understand as part of the modern world. So whereas Americans might not pay any attention to French strategic culture or French military thought, the French absolutely pay close attention to how the American military functions and what it thinks, etc. Their criticism reflects, I think, the approach of the perspective of a country with fewer resources and of a military that has fewer resources. And my way of understanding this is that whereas the American way of war, I think, presumes vast resources. It's a way of warfare that works if you're really, really rich. The French, because they don't have the resources, have had to think differently and had to develop other approaches to warfare. And they've done it while keeping an eye on the Americans and thinking about the differences. So therefore, I think that this is relevant and of interest for an American audience. Now, French works on American military culture and American strategic culture actually are numerous. But the thing that I stress, the most useful thing, is this book. It's a big book called Traité de Stratégie, Treatise on Strategy, by Hervé Couteau-Begary, who is this extraordinary scholar of strategy. He's really amazing, and as you can see, I made a few notes in this book. It's really great. Most of this book has nothing to do with the U.S., but it's all about different kinds of strategy, naval strategy, aviation strategy. He breaks it all down. But there's a lot, he says a lot about Americans and refers to American strategic culture. And what he says is really very relevant. Plus, he dominated the field in France, so whatever he said mattered and people read him. And this is sort of book that French military officers, maybe they haven't read as carefully as I have, but they own it, they have it, they know what this is. I've even seen I've seen it on my shelf here in the background. So, oh, look at you, you've got Couteau-Begary on your bookshelf. Yeah, I do. The other book is this that I'm going to refer to, Tactique théorique by General Michel Yakovlev, which is also a very important work, also a big reference for the French military, and he too also has a lot to say about the Americans. Okay, so what did they say? Several things. First of all, Hervé Couteau-Begary, he observes, among other things, a tendency on the part of Americans to seek total victory, fueled, he says, in part by a tendency to moralize conflicts and to believe that America fights just wars and does so on behalf of liberty and against the enemies of democracy. So those that the United States fights, therefore, are criminals, they're evil. And one thing that comes from this, according to Couteau-Begary, is a tendency to believe that once the fight is joined, pretty much anything is permitted. And as for the recent imperative to fight clean wars or surgical wars, he says that this is just sort of a reflection, a reaction to, he calls it the eruption of audiovisual media, right? Because now people can see what's going on. But it doesn't seem to have substantially modified the American attitude. So he says, yeah, we go for surgical strikes and precision, and we try to limit collateral damage, but that doesn't really fundamentally change the approach to warfare. Couteau-Begary describes American strategy and tactics in terms of, quote, the search for mass, principally material. You have as much stuff as you possibly can to throw at the enemy. The roots of this, Couteau-Begary says, is in the United States' economic wealth, but also the bloody consequences or the bloody experience of the Civil War, which encouraged the desire to limit losses. So the way to hedge risk and to guarantee that as few of your own people die as possible, you try to have as much power and as much mass to throw at the enemy to minimize your own casualties while maximizing the casualties of your enemies. So Couteau-Berry then argues, for example, that Pershing, General Pershing, did not deploy the American Expeditionary Force to the front lines in World War I until he had assembled enough material strength to avoid having his guys massacred. He thought this was very important. Massacred like what happened to the British and the French in 1914, when basically they were too light. The infantry was too light and they just got absolutely slaughtered. In World War II, the American military routinely favored firepower to maneuver and shock. Citing French General Alain Brou, Couteau-Berry described the American way of war as, I love this line, a gigantic work of demolition, a story of shells, bombs, and today missiles intended to take out of action most of the adverse forces such that an attack would only encounter residual resistance. I love this, a gigantic work of demolition. French observers of the Americans in World War II, like once the Americans had gotten into the fight, saw this, that they saw the Americans as pushing demolition firepower, you destroy everything, you don't bother with maneuver, whereas the French they just have an approach because they didn't have the firepower, so let's maneuver, let's do maneuver, let's show some audacity, and the Americans no, we don't need audacity, we just need a lot of howitzers, a lot of howitzers. Whenever he says, Couteau-Berry says, whenever resistance turns out to be greater than expected, the advance stops and awaits for fires to do their work. So the result, according to Couteau-Berry, is, he says, less flamboyant than that of the French, but terribly effective. And he continues, Americans don't have the Cameroon syndrome. For them, the destruction of an isolated unit is not a glorious episode, but rather the result of a planning error that one must avoid at any price. Now, Cameroon refers to a battle in Mexico in 1863, in which a company of French Foreign Legionnaires held out almost to the last man. And the French Foreign Legion celebrates the Battle of Cameroon to this day. It's a big celebration, which is weird because it's a defeat, but it's a glorious defeat. Similarly, the French Marines celebrate the 1870 defeat, the Battle of Bazet, in which a Marine division held off a Bavarian army before the survivors were finally ordered to withdraw. Again, it's a defeat, but it's a noble feat. It's a heroic one. This is something that the French military kind of thinks is pretty cool, whereas according to Couteau-Berry, for the Americans, this is a shocking failure, and it's a planning failure. One weakness Couteau-Berry sees in the American approach to war is what he considers to be a difficult relationship between the military and civilian leaders. American military leaders, he says, are guilty of, quote, a cult of decisive force, unquote. Right? Think back to what we said earlier in the last video about the importance of decisive battle and the importance in American military thinking of fixing the enemy and destroying the enemy and thinking that that's where strategic decision lay. So it says that the American military still has this cult, and as a result, there's a real reticence, or even, he says, an incapacity to understand the subservience of operations to political ends. This has been, by the way, I think a hallmark of French strategic thinking, at least since World War II, where all the most important French theorists, even before World War II with Castex, argue over and over and over again for the subservience of military operations to political ends. And this for them is a lesson of Algeria and Indochina, and this is what has to happen. So, but it's an approach where you have limited means, limited resources, so you serve limited ends and you aim to have limited effects. Another problem, according to Couteau-Berry, is that American strategic culture privileges planning over execution. He says, extensive coordination, careful preparation, and the accumulation of means should make it possible to reduce to a minimum friction of all kinds and to attain the objective in conformity with the plan. This tendency, he argues, was already on display in the two world wars, but it became markedly worse after 1945 with the creation of, he's quote, a gigantic bureaucratic machine. I would also argue the advent of the operations research and McNamara and this idea that you can quantitatively analyze absolutely like 99% of a problem to minimize uncertainty to the greatest possible extent. He says, Couteau-Berry says, centralization reached extreme levels during the Vietnam War. The White House micromanaged operations, and the commanders in the field struggled to adapt and to respond flexibly to realities on the ground. And then Couto-Begueri says comes the 1991 Gulf War, where he says this represented a decisive reversion to the norm. Why? Per Bruno Colson, another scholar, a French scholar, who writes about American strategic culture, and he's cited by Couto-Begueri and wrote a lot in books that were like edited by Couto-Begueri. Colson writes about the Gulf War. He says, although the U.S. Army tried after Vietnam to assimilate Clausewitz's warnings and restrain on the tendency to believe that everything will happen according to plan, the Gulf War confirmed its traditional vision, which he says, by the way, is inherited from Jomini, that of a battlefield where everything is rational and programmable. Quantitative, rational, programmable. You can plan the hell out of anything and reduce risk to as little as possible. Couto-Begueri argues also that Americans' planning mentality makes it difficult for them to adapt to the adversary. He says while it's an advantage in symmetrical conflicts, we talked about this in the previous video, Americans struggle, right? And in a symmetrical context, he says their technical power can express itself fully. But in asymmetrical contexts, Americans really struggle. Asymmetrical conflicts are those in which the political elements tend to be more important than the military instrument. The military instrument you can hone, you can study, you can analyze, you can use all this fancy operations research. But with the smaller stuff, the asymmetrical things, the military stuff is really, frankly, less relevant anyways. So Americans' abilities, technical abilities, become less relevant. Couto-Begueri says that Americans' obsessive mentality makes them very little open to the ideas and more of other people, and that also holds for other ways to make war. Vietnam, he says, was a case in point. He says there was almost no one in the Expeditionary Corps who spoke Vietnamese, and Americans had a hard time establishing contacts with the population and attempted, but failed, to bring an end to northern Vietnam's resistance through bombardment and technical gadgets. Couto-Begueri saw history repeat itself in Iraq, where once again U.S. forces had to deal with a population that was radically different. The same had been true in Somalia. There, Couto-Begueri bemoaned the, quote, incapacity of American patrols to move about other than with heavily armed convoys protected by helicopters that flew at low altitude, which terrorized livestock and people and engendered a sentiment of rejection with regard to the American contingent. He insists that French and Italian contingents, which behaved differently, did not engender the same hostility. They, quote, knew how to establish contact with inhabitants. Take that for what you will. Finally, Couto-Begueri says that the United States killed war, quote unquote, by becoming so militarily powerful that no one dares to confront it in open warfare. The result is that conflict becomes almost exclusively asymmetrical, with clandestine groups availing themselves of terrorism or urban guerrilla, forcing Americans to fight them on their terrain. And yet the technical mentality continues to dominate American military establishment, notwithstanding the fact that it's arguably less applicable. The American military, whose budget has continued to climb since 2001, Couto-Begueri continues to invest in expensive programs like the F-35 at the expense of simple means that are more useful in regional and local crises. Okay, then we get to General Yakovlev. Yakovlev, in the introduction to this edition, says the following. He says that Western armies suffer from a number of what he calls false postulates. One of them, he says, is the scientist fad, which he defines as the idea that there's a technical solution to any tactical problem. I think this is certainly true of the American military. Yakovlev is scornful of ideas such as information dominance, which, among other things, encourages deciders to keep seeking ever more information while disregarding the law of diminishing returns, and in the meantime putting off making decisions. Besides, quote, the quality of a decision has no established correlation with the quantity of information available to the leader at the moment of the decision, unquote. Yakov also condemns what he says as a corollary fad, which is the idea that war can be conducted in a rational, scientific, and methodical way. Indeed, Yakovlev writes that, quote, Western military culture is victim of the spirit of process to such an extent that our deciders do not even realize it. Interestingly enough, he uses the English word process in a French text, right? Because he's associating this with Americans. This is an American kind of concept that he's referring to. Indeed, Yakovlev writes, Western military culture is a victim of the spirit of process. The quality of the solution continues matters so little as it results from the rigorous application of a required process. This is dangerous, he says, for among other things, our adversaries know how to use the spirit of finesse, which largely compensates for their technological inferiority. Yakovlev is interested in finesse. He says, in order for our military to be worthy of the confidence of the population, it must rediscover the art of war, which to him means rediscovering the art of finesse, and backing away from the use of technology and the use of process. Okay. Now, so there is this French critique that the French argue that the Americans are being too Geminian, which to them means too much banking. It banks too much on the idea of process and the idea that the battlefield can be rational and you could use method and you could take as much risk as possible out of the battlefield. The French often accuse the Americans of being too Geminian, which to them means too much about process and too rational and more into the sort of the idea of like you can have a science of warfare, whereas Clausewitz is somebody that the French associate with being more into sort of the art of war and the spirit of war and a little bit more interested in finesse. And he says that also the Americans do read Clausewitz, but they misapply it. And he says that one of the things that Americans do is that they confuse success with the conditions for success. And he says that this is associated with the problem of Clausewitzian concept of the center of gravity, which is, he says, the basis of American tactical reasoning. So what do I mean by this? So Yakovlev says that the center of gravity is defined as the, quote, the material or immaterial source of the adversary's power from which he draws his liberty of action, his physical force and his will to fight. Yakov has several problems with this, and he believes that Americans are focused on this. Yakovlev has several problems with this. He says, the first is that it's static rather than dynamic. One analyzes the enemy, determines the center of gravity, and there it is, unchanging. The second is that, quote, American military thinking leads almost mechanically to attacking the center of gravity in order to obtain victory. This creates, he argues, a paradox, for it amounts to attacking the enemy's strength, but not its vulnerability. Now, he clarifies this. He says that attacking the enemy's strength can be very effective in situations in which one has the forces at one's disposal to attempt such a thing. But if one is weak and doesn't have the ability to do that, when attacking a strong adversary, it makes little sense. It's almost suicide. Therefore, the focus has to be on going for the vulnerability rather than going for the center of gravity. The French also have with this idea of the effet majeur. And what I mean by this is that for the French, it's important to study a situation to understand that if you move this pawn here, this will set about a situation where there's almost going to be a chain reaction, with the result being that you will achieve your desired effect. The desired effect ultimately leading not to a decisive military victory, because they're not really banking on that anyways, but to achieving the political objective required. So it's not about the maximalists that go straight at the center of gravity and destroy the enemy. It's rather, let's move our pawn, which is going to force the enemy to do this, that, and the other thing. It's going to have all these effects, which will get us to our limited objective, our limited political objective. That's the French approach. And it stems, I believe, from a lack of resources and understanding that they don't have resources. So let's pull this all together. In the previous video, we talked about the American way of war in terms of Weigly, in terms of the idea that Americans studied the Napoleonic campaigns through Clausewitz and Germany, and took it from this idea that you seek decisive battle, destroy the enemy in decisive battle, which they then elevated under Grant and Sherman into this idea of annihilation, destroy the enemy. This, according to Weigly, continued into World War II and even continued in the post-war era, where despite the fact that the American military recurrently finds itself in small wars, ends up trying always to brings this big war approach to it, which is ultimately all about blowing up the enemy, massive firepower, its demolition, using its technical capabilities in order to destroy things, notwithstanding the fact that it's of arguable value, debatable value, in these very different kinds of conflicts. Add to that this penchant for operations research and quantitative analysis, which feeds what the French would say is this sort of Geminian thing, and also reinforces this idea of sticking to a fight that involves things that readily lend themselves to quantitative analysis. And ultimately, I would argue that Weigly's arguments more or less hold up. And, as part of this, you have the sort of fetish of technology, which makes perfect sense. It fits into this. Then the French come and say, look, This there's this penchant for mass destruction that the Americans have, of completely destroying the enemy. And even when they're trying to do limited things to limit collateral damage, they're ultimately using their gadgets in order to blow up the enemy. And they still have this mindset. So when they find themselves in circumstances in which that's really not an appropriate way of going about warfare, and where it's less about firepower, more about finesse, the Americans are really at a disadvantage. Of course, then the French say that they are an advantage. Now, that, of course, is entirely debatable. And then the French add to this this idea that there's a scientism that's going on. There's a sort of an obsession with technology, and science is belief that technology can solve any tactical problem, which I think is totally true. They also see on the part of the Americans this obsession with planning and this belief that you can plan and plan and plan and plan, and through planning and rational calculation and quantitative analysis, you can reduce to the minimum the amount of risk involved in an operation, and you can also reduce your own casualties, and you can also aim to go for the center of gravity, meaning you can have a maximalist approach to destroying the enemy, which the French would say is premised on the fact that Americans have almost infinite resources and can think of these terms, like what's the best case scenario? What can we possibly do? Whereas the French, they say, because they have limited means, don't think about doing the optimal. They think about sort of the minimal that they can get away with that's going to have a desired effect, which would be a limited effect, but that makes a lot of sense in a limited war in which you're trying to achieve limited political objectives, which for many kinds of warfare is entirely what's required. Thank you very much. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Also, please go and check out the previous video where I talked about Weigling and set the stage for this conversation. And if you look in the description, I've got some links to books to check out. If you buy anything through the links, that actually helps this channel. Please check out my Substack, Pax Americana. Again, link in the description. You can come find me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and also on my website, michaelshurkin.com. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye-bye.